So I'm continuing to talk about confidence and the confidence to speak up. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. I have been talking about the Daughters of Zelophehad, aka Zelo is what I call him, because that is a long name. A lot of times when I look at biblical stories, I apply a lot of imagination. So if you don't like that, you might not like the way I think about and talk and discuss these, but it brings it to life for me. So the daughters of Zelophehad were five girls, daughters, whose father died, and they spoke up so that they could claim his land as their own inheritance. They were not married. This is a story from the biblical Old Testament. So during that time, women could not own land. You only were just married and your husband owned everything. But because their dad had died, and had not married anyone off, they didn't have anyone that could get the land for them. They were five daughters and they decided to stick together and go ask for the land themselves. They have always been a story that I loved, and it was always a story that I felt like wasn't talked about enough. And it was very empowering, right? Because these girls, they spoke up and they didn't shrink back, and they decided to just take those matters into their own hands. And when they did, God sided with them and said, the daughters of Zelophehad are correct. I'm going to give them their land. And then, of course, later, some men came back and were like, well, I mean, what about if they marry into another tribe? So then God came back and said, okay, I will allow the daughters to marry whoever they want to marry within this certain tribe, which was their own, so that the land stayed within the tribe. Even in that decision, God still gave the daughters the decision on who they wanted to marry. And so I want to start off by saying that these daughters did not shrink. These women, at a time when the cultural norm was not for them to speak up, they did not shrink, though, in rooms of power and authority. So, some backstory: the children of Israel had left Egypt and were supposed to go into a promised land. It took them 40 years to get to the point where they could enter the promised land. And so, right before they were going to enter, Moses, he didn't get to enter with them, but he had to do a census of who was alive, who would get what land, etc., etc., etc. It was after this census of the people that would be entering the land. Right after this census is when the daughters spoke up. And so the scripture says in Numbers 27, then after the census, the daughters of Zelophehad, aka Zelo, came forward. Zelophehad's lineage was then listed, and Zelophehad had come from Joseph's lineage. Now, Joseph is another person that I love his story, but it took me a minute to connect the dots and realize that these five daughters were descendants of Joseph, which I feel like is a big deal. I feel like they picked up that legacy and continued forward. And just knowing that they came from Joseph's lineage, knowing that Joseph had been second in command over Egypt under Pharaoh, knowing that Joseph's whole heritage was about preservation. He was over governmental rule. He was over laws. These daughters, these great, 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 great 400 years later granddaughters were still flowing in that same anointing. And the reason I feel like that is important is because often we can have gifts and talents and we think we just have them. No, they have been passed down from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. And then they landed with us. And so often we can just trace our lineages. We can look at what our parents, grandparents, great, 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 great grandparents, what their anointing was, what they were good at, what they flowed in, and we can get a glimpse of some of the gifts that we also have. Sometimes they went a certain amount and they didn't go any further, but we pick up that torch and we carry it on through. This is legacy. And so their story to me is about generational legacy continued, but through women, which was unheard of at the time. And so the daughters came forward. It lists their lineages. Their names were Mala, Noah, Hagla, Milcah, and Tirzah. And they all stood before Moses. So they had to go to Moses. It was like a court setting, if you will. So they would go into this tent where Moses and the priest would, and the other leaders, all the congregation who were there, they would hear out anyone's grievance. You could bring your issue before this court. So they step in and they say, our father died in the wilderness, but he was not among the company of those gathered together against the Lord in the company of Korah, but he died for his own sins. So he wasn't a part of a rebel group that had gotten in trouble with God. He ended up dying for his own sins, right? And they said, he had no sons, so he only had 5 daughters. But why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give us a possession among our father's brothers. So they were asking for something that had never been asked for before because this was unheard of. But they didn't think that they shouldn't just because the culture dismissed them, which I think is very powerful, especially for the time. During this time, they weren't supposed to or encouraged to speak up for themselves and ask for anything. But for some reason, these 5 young women were empowered to speak up. Again, I'm going to give some of that credit to them being a part of Joseph's lineage. Joseph was just a natural leader. His abilities were in governmental rule. He thought about a lot of things on a different level and ended up being the second in command. Again, these young women were a part of that lineage. And so it could be some of that was in them, right? That empowered them to speak up. And so then Moses heard them out. So again, they weren't just immediately dismissed, which I think says a lot about Moses. He heard them out and took their case before the Lord. And the Lord spoke to Moses and said, the daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they are saying. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance among their father's brothers and pass the inheritance of their father to them. You shall also, and so this started changing the laws. God continued, you shall also say to the Israelites, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall pass his inheritance on to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you should give it to his brothers. If he has no brothers, then give it his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then give the inheritance to the nearest kinsman of his clan, and he shall possess it. It shall be for Israelite a statute and ordinance as the Lord commanded Moses. This also, I think, set the stage for the story of Ruth later on. Ruth was all about a clansman redeemer, which it had to go from who was next in line to redeem the family name. But anyway, I just thought, wow, when I really honed in on this story, again, this isn't a story I grew up hearing about. I don't even know how I found this story, except I read a lot of stories about women or about characters who may have a couple of scriptures, a very small line or two. Maybe they're not named. Those are the stories I like to search out in the Bible. I've always liked to search out those stories because I feel like often we focus on the big hitters, like Joseph. I love the story of Joseph, but Joseph is one of them big hitter stories, right? But then following his lineage to see these five daughters of Zelophehad in Joseph's lineage. So his son Manasseh, that's the clan they were a part of. To follow that and to just see from his greatness was still greatness, right? It's not a story, like I said, that I grew up hearing about a lot, but it was one that I dug out myself as I read the word myself. Another thing about them that I realized with these 5 daughters is they entered into the promised land. They were a part of the Joshua generation that entered into the promised land. I would always hear a lot about Joshua, the Joshua generation. Again, these 5 daughters helped change, right, what women could have, what they could inherit, and they entered into the promised land as well. So I thought that this was very empowering because, again, they did not shrink from authority or power and they just showed up. And so, often things can happen to us. I've shared my story a lot about being fired twice and in the same year, and how that was a pivotal moment in my own personal journey, right? And for a while I was internalizing that rejection. I was internalizing it, and it was causing me to shrink back, maybe not speak up as much, right? But ultimately I had to keep going because either I was going to stay where I was, which was fired and feeling like I didn't have much to offer, or I was going to continue my path forward, which was leading me to re-enroll in school. I ended up getting a second bachelor's, right? And during that time when I wasn't working, I reconnected to my birth family, back to lineage, right? Back to the importance of lineage. And so for me, that time was very important. I can't go back and get that time back. And what that gave me, as far as my foundation, as far as my identity, as far as who I am now and what I am accomplishing now, was built on a lot of the time in my life where it looked like I was not accomplishing much. But it was at this time where I was accomplishing some of the most important work, both my school work, right? And my own personal journey work that I would do. That work, digging through that identity, reconnecting to my birth family, going through that process and really dealing with that is why I'm here now. Is how I got to the point where I was empowered to speak up, where I started looking at biblical stories different. Is because I had to go and reconnect to my own lineage. So then when I started looking at any kind of story, it could be a movie I was watching on TV, it could be the Bible, it could be a book. I started looking for themes of lineage, connection. I started looking for just different themes because for the first time in my life, I started realizing that I wasn't an island and that a lot of my gifts and talents and who I was reflected in my lineage. And so often if you grow up already connected to your family, you may miss it because you're just so used to having it. But for me, it was a discovery that I was making. And so, and like any discovery, I dug in. And so then I would sit with these stories and I would say, how do I see myself in some of these stories? So with the Daughters of Zelophehad, for example, how do I see myself in them, right? Do I shrink in rooms of power and authority, or would I be bold enough to just ask, to just seek? Well, I was being bold. I asked, I sought, I had to find, right? I had to go and look up my birth records. I had to write to the state. I had to ask, right? I couldn't just take no for an answer. Then I spoke to someone and they were wanting to know, well, why do you want to connect with your birth family? And then I told them, don't you know your family? So I spoke up in truth and it opened the door for me, right? I wasn't speaking up maliciously. I wasn't trying to be funny. I was asked a question and I boldly asked the question back. And that was how my door was open to actually get the information I needed that ultimately connected me to my family. So when I read the stories of these five young women, I kept digging in it. I kept digging in it. I actually used this story for a class project. And so I had to really research this story. And that's how I started also going deeper. They came from Joseph's lineage. Joseph, who was second in command under Pharaoh, who was determining governmental rule and laws. When these five young women spoke up and asked for their father's inheritance, that changed the law. God agreed with them, sided with them, and decided, hey, and right here, before y'all step into this promised land, I'm going to change the very laws that y'all had in place to make sure that if a man dies without sons, his daughter can inherit his land. Again, so then some of the men spoke up out of concern, saying, well, what if they marry in a different clan? God said, oh, okay, well, I would let them pick who they want to marry as long as they marry within this clan. And so still they were determining their own fate at a time where that was unheard of, right? Now, we don't get a lot about their father. I don't know, what at what point he died, how long he had been dead. I mean, of course, apparently he had these five girls before he died. So No one knows their ages necessarily, or how long their father had been dead. So when they spoke up, we don't know if it was grief that had just happened and their father died, if he had been gone for a while. We don't know. All we know is that the descendants of Joseph decided, let's speak up, and speaking up changed the laws of their time. Their story is powerful because in the early 1900s in the United States, it was decided that women could own land, and it was all built off the story of the Daughters of Zelophehad. That was used to cite the precedent about women owning land in the United States in the early 1900s. This was the law that came into being because these girls spoke up in a biblical Old Testament story. And so the power of it lies in the fact that not only did they change their fate, them speaking up, them not shrinking back, them deciding they could at least just ask, impacted people thousands of years later that they don't even know, they didn't know they were going to impact, which goes back to Joseph. Joseph being a dreamer, Joseph, getting to where God decided he was supposed to be, impacted these girls, impacted our time. And so just following that thread is like wow, right? And again, I share a lot about different things that could make you shrink back. And so one of the things I shared was undergrad and how I did not graduate when I was supposed to with the cohort that I went in with, right? And that did cause me to shrink for a while, question my worth. I felt like I was missing the mark, right? But I did push past it eventually, right? And so, what I'm saying with that is a lot of times the cultural norm will be telling you this is your path, this is where you should be. If you're not here, if you're not doing this, you're not on the right path. I was on the right path, right? I just didn't realize it. Like these daughters, I had to go a different path than everyone else, but I still landed where I was supposed to be, right? It's just amazing when you sit down and you look at different stories and you just compare them to yourself, something I love to do. Amazing what you can find out about yourself, some areas that you may want to improve, right? And so sometimes you can look at it and say, where did I shrink back that I should have spoken up, right? There are times when I should have spoken up. What were they? What caused me to shrink back? Was I intimidated by who I was stepping in front of? Back to these young women, they were stepping in front of Moses, the Moses, honey, the Moses that spoke face to face with God. Okay, that's intimidating right there. I don't know if I would have been, I'd have been like, I don't know. Maybe if I step in here, maybe they don't like it because it wasn't the norm of the day. So they had to push past all kind of barriers, all kind of you ain't supposed to be here, women don't speak, blah blah blah, to step in front of this great man of God, in front of this person who spoke face to face with God, to plead their little old case. But had they not, then what? Right? Again, their story impacted everyone after them. Their story impacts the story of Ruth, whose story was all about a kinsman redeemer, or AKA the person in their lineage, the person in the lineage that could redeem and marry Ruth after her husband had passed. Her mother in law didn't have any more sons. So all of this is very intricately tied together, but it took me a long time to see it like that because I heard stories growing up, biblical stories, but I don't know if I was tying them together or if they were taught tied together. Again, I remember hearing and remembering those big names, those big stories, but those big stories and those smaller stories are all intertwined, right? They're all intertwined. Back to cultural norms that say follow the crowd. But a lot of times, God's timing is different in your life than whatever the script is, right? You're not supposed to dismiss yourself because your timeline or because whatever it is isn't the cultural norm, right? Don't dismiss yourself, right? you have to work on, and I talk about this a lot, your inner self-belief, your inner self-confidence, so that you don't dismiss whatever piece you're supposed to bring to the table, whatever room you're supposed to step in, right? Um, Again, I just think it's amazing that they are in the lineage of Joseph, who was over decision making and policy and second in command, and their anointing still flowed. And when they spoke up, it impacted decision making and policies that were impacting people into the 20th century in America. It is just amazing to me, right? That you have to really fight so hard to speak up, but when you do, on the other side of that, on the other side of developing your self belief, on the other side of uprooting some beliefs out of yourself that don't serve you, uprooting beliefs that try to tell you to shrink, on the other side of that, who are you called to impact? Now, whenever I talk about this, I always feel it very strongly. Whoever is listening to this later, right? You are called to impact someone. Who is it that you're called to impact, right? By you shrinking, by you not dealing with those inner beliefs that tell you you shouldn't speak up, by you dimming your light, by you not saying the thing, by you not showing up, you're impacting someone. And by you showing up, by you speaking up, by you shining your light, you're also impacting people. And so you have to make a decision. What do you want to do? Do you want to have that impact, right? Or do you want to continue to shrink back? Again, who is waiting for you though? Who needs you to say the thing, to step into the room, to have the confidence and the boldness and the self-belief to know that you bring something very valuable to the table right now in our day and time? Someone needs that. Someone needs your example. Someone needs a key that you have. Often in the past, I realized I would dismiss what I was bringing to the table, thinking, well, it's not a big deal. It's something small. Somebody else is probably bringing it to the table. No, if you don't bring that thing to the table, big or small, it's not coming to the table because you were assigned to bring that thing to the table. Again, often I would dismiss whatever it was that I was bringing because I always thought, well, it's just little, if I'm thinking about it, someone else is thinking about it. That's not always the case. Sometimes they're thinking about their part and you're supposed to be thinking about your part, and then you bring it to the table and then it becomes, better together. So where are you holding back, shrinking? Where are you second guessing yourself, right? I have a program for that. I want you to check it out. It's called Flourish Forward. It's different tiers to the program. I will put in the comments. I will definitely post the tiers and the different um, tiers that you can join. But I definitely want you to really think about, are you supposed to be showing up? And if so, why aren't you showing up? What's preventing you from showing up? Is it a lack of self-belief? What's going on with you? Again, I have a coaching program that is designed to help you with that. I will post it in the comments. Definitely take my free confidence quiz. It's totally free. I will post that and I will make sure I go in and pin it. But I wanted to bring these daughters more about their story. They are some of my favorite biblical sheroes. And I hope you enjoy, just learning a little bit more about them. And I will see you in the next video. Have a good one.